Route 64 is an 18-kilometre long tram line running to the south of the Melbourne CBD, through the dense inner southeastern suburbs of Windsor, Armidale and Caulfield, then down to the affluent bayside suburb of Brighton East. There's also a short branch along Wattletree Road to Malvern in the form of Route 5, which I'll also cover in this video too. These are both quite interesting routes. They traverse some of the busiest and most attractive sections of tramway in Melbourne, and also have quite an interesting operating style seen nowhere else on the tram network. Routes 5 and 64 are operated using trams and drivers from two different depots. Route 64 is operated out of Glenhuntly Depot using entirely high floor trams in the form of the Z3 and B2 class, while Route 5 is operated out of Malvern Depot using a mixture of Z3 and the low floor D1 class trams, which are based exclusively at Malvern. We're going to start at Melbourne University on Swanston Street, which is the northern terminus of routes 5 and 64. This is one of the busiest stops on the network due to it being the northern end of the busiest tram corridor in the world, and its main purpose is to serve the Parkville campus of the University of Melbourne, which is one of the oldest tertiary education institutions in Australia, having been established in 1853. The line on Swanston Street south of here carries 8 routes, 6 of which terminate here at Melbourne Uni, with routes 1 and 6 being the only 2 which continue north from here into Elgin Street. To handle the sheer number of trams that terminate here, there are 3 sidings located between the 2 running lines, and these are used as required to terminate trams. The terminus is equipped with a complicated signalling system which was upgraded in February 2024, and there are displays that tell drivers which sidings are available. In the event all 3 sidings are full, trams are also able to reverse direction using this crossover just around the corner in Elgin Street. Since becoming the main terminus for the Swanston Street corridor in 1996, the stop at Melbourne Uni has been upgraded several times, most notably in 2005 when the current track layout was implemented. Before the 2005 upgrade, trams reversed direction here using a 100-metre long centre track, which was accessed by means of 3 crossovers. This layout was implemented back in 1996, at a time when the only trams operating in Melbourne were high-floor trams. However, when the low-floor D1 class trams started entering service in the mid-2000s, it became clear this track layout wasn't going to work going forward, as the new trams weren't able to fit in the space between the crossovers. So, as a result, the terminus was upgraded, receiving the current track layout we see today. The old ground-level side platforms were replaced by a large straight island platform, which is long enough to fit up to 3 short trams in each direction. There are also these quote-unquote steel trees, which shelter the platform somewhat. From Melbourne Uni, routes 5 and 64 head downhill through the suburb of Carlton along Swanston Street towards the CBD, crossing Grattan Street and passing Lincoln Square. On this section of the line, trams don't share a lane with cars. However, the separation is quite minimal, so there's a constant risk of vehicles making dangerous turns in front of trams here. At the next major intersection, Queensbury Street, there's a crossover, providing a place for trams to terminate short in case of a disruption, or if the terminus at Melbourne Uni is full. This first part of the line from here down to St Kilda Junction is the oldest part, and first opened in 1888 as the Brighton Road Cable Tramway. This line ran from Queensbury Street in Carlton down to Brunning Street in Elwood. However, routes 5 and 64 only run along this section as far as St Kilda Junction, while the bit south to Brunning Street and beyond is part of the modern-day Route 67. This line was electrified in sections in the mid-1920s, beginning with St Kilda Junction to Domain Interchange and Queensbury Street to City Road in 1925, then followed by Domain Interchange to City Road in 1926. Meanwhile, the line north of Queensbury Street to Melbourne Uni, and in fact beyond, was built in 1916 as part of the electric tramway to East Coburg, which is now the northern half of the modern-day Route 1. Continuing south from Queensbury Street, we reach the bottom of the hill where the line crosses Victoria Street. This is the location of a junction for a short line which runs for about 300 metres down Victoria Street to Elizabeth Street, where it joins up with routes 19, 57 and 59. In complete contrast to Swanston Street, this is, at the time of writing, one of the least used parts of the network, as no regular routes use this line. It's only ever used for diversions, depot transfers, special events, or other unusual moves. The line actually used to join Swanston Street about 50 metres south of here at Franklin Street, but in 2024 the track was realigned via the Swanston and Victoria Street intersection, which allowed the former alignment to be repurposed into a small public park, which is arguably a much better use of this valuable inner city space. Within the new park is this building, the Franklin Street Signal Box, which was the last operating signal box on the tram network, operating until 1991. Now, the reason for having a signal box here is because the line on Victoria Street actually used to be the northern terminus of the Swanston Street corridor. The terminus was equipped with 3 crossovers, one next to the signal box and 2 more in Victoria Street, and tram movements here were controlled from the signal box, with a signaller allocating each incoming tram a position to terminate. Victoria Street remained the main terminus of the Swanston Street corridor until 1991, after a number of fatal accidents involving pedestrians saw it taken out of use and the signal box was closed. Services were altered to terminate at some of the intermediate crossovers on Swanston Street, and this arrangement lasted until 1996 when a quote-unquote permanent head shunt was built at Melbourne Uni, which is still the terminus today. The terminus at Victoria Street was briefly reactivated in early 2005, being used as the temporary terminus of routes 3, 64 and 67 while Melbourne Uni was being rebuilt. But since that project was completed, it hasn't seen regular use as a terminus. The Franklin Street signal box was left in place after the track realignment as it's heritage listed, and is the only signal box on the tram network still standing today. Anyway, back to Swanston Street. The junction at Victoria Street is rather interesting as the points for the line into Victoria Street are actually still in their original pre-realignment position back on the other side of Franklin Street, creating a short section of gauntlet track and providing a place for left-turning trams to wait without blocking the main line. Given no regular routes use this line at the time of riding, this layout isn't really necessary. However, there are plans to redirect some of the Swanston Street routes down Victoria Street into North Melbourne, possibly down a new line to Arden Station, and the track layout has been future-proofed to allow that to happen. Continuing south, routes 5 and 64 pass the city baths before curving to align with the Hoddle grid, crossing Franklin Street and entering the Melbourne CBD. Just next to the line here is the city campus of the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT, the second major university we've passed so far. If you watched my Route 86 video, you'll know that RMIT has a campus in Bundoora at the northern end of Route 86, but that isn't RMIT's main campus. Their main campus is here on Swanston Street in the city. Uniquely among Melbourne's major university campuses, the RMIT City Campus is scattered across 6 city blocks, with the densest part being in the area bounded by Elizabeth Street, Russell Street, Franklin Street, and Latrobe Street. The stop at RMIT is a really busy place and is used extensively by students who arrive at the university by tram. This short section of Swanston Street south of Franklin Street is car-free, having been closed to vehicular traffic in late 2012. However, this changes just moments later on the other side of the tram stop at A Beckett Street, where vehicular traffic briefly returns. Continuing south on Swanston Street, routes 5 and 64 reach the northern end of the actual Hoddle grid and cross Route 30 and the City Circle at Latrobe Street before passing the State Library of Victoria and the Melbourne Central Shopping Centre. There's a double track curve on the northwestern corner of the Latrobe Street intersection, which is commonly used to divert trams during a disruption, which I'll talk more about a bit later. There's also another crossover just south of the tram stop at the intersection with Little Lonsdale Street, providing another place for trams to terminate and reverse direction in case of a disruption, late running, or if the terminus at Melbourne Uni is full. Passengers are able to change here for Sunbury, Pakenham and Cranbourne line trains at State Library Station, and also City Loop services at Melbourne Central Station, which is accessed from inside the shopping centre. State Library Station is the first of 3 connections with the Metro Tunnel, which runs underneath the Swanston Street corridor for the next 2 kilometres and provides a complimentary service to the tramway. At the time I'm writing this, the tunnel isn't open yet, so it still remains to be seen how much of a difference the tunnel actually makes to tram passenger traffic on Swanston Street, but it is expected to relieve some of the pressure on this extremely busy corridor. Speaking of crowds, the stop here on Swanston Street is one of the busiest on the system, and despite the extremely high frequency, trams from here to the other end of the city are always packed. At Latrobe Street, Swanston Street becomes car-free once again, which remains the case all the way to the other end of the CBD. This part of Swanston Street was closed to vehicular traffic in 1992, and today is used by a large number of trams, pedestrians and cyclists. Initially, the section of Swanston Street between Latrobe Street and Flinders Street was only car-free during the daytime between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m, but in 2012 the ban was extended to all hours of the day, making the street completely car-free, and the ban area was also extended to cover the section between A. Beckett and Franklin Streets, which wasn't included in the initial ban. While the street is car-free, I wouldn't say it's actually pedestrianised, as there are still lanes for road traffic here, which are used by a small number of authorised vehicles, such as delivery trucks to local businesses and emergency services. However, all in all, the ban has certainly had a positive impact and has certainly helped to transform Swanston Street into the bustling main street of the city we know today. From Melbourne Central, routes 5 and 64 continue south past QV and cross the CBD's main east-west bus corridor at Lonsdale Street, which carries bus routes headed out to the eastern suburbs and Doncaster, including the 4 Doncaster area rapid transit routes, which I've spent plenty of time talking about in other videos, so feel free to check those out if you're interested. After Lonsdale Street, the line crosses Little Burke Street and passes the southern end of Chinatown, Melbourne's major Chinese district, before we arrive at Burke Street, where we cross the very busy routes 86 and 96. Just around the corner in Burke Street is the Burke Street Mall, arguably the most notable car-free part of the city and the only proper pedestrian mall in the CBD. I would talk a bit more about the mall, but I already have in my Route 86 video, so if you want to learn a bit more about it, go over and watch that if you haven't already. Continuing through the CBD, the line then passes the Melbourne Town Hall and the Capitol Theatre before crossing Collins Street and tram routes 11, 12, 48 and 109. On the southeastern corner of the intersection is City Square, which was recently reinstated after having been demolished in 2017 so it could become a construction site for Town Hall Station, also part of a brand new Melbourne Metro tunnel. Within City Square there is an entrance to the station, allowing passengers to change for Metro tunnel services here. It's also possible to access Flinders Street Station from Town Hall using the paid link between the two stations, something which is pretty useful during wet weather. The Town Hall itself is another very historic building. It was built in 1867, replacing an earlier structure built in 1854, and serves as the administrative seat of the City of Melbourne. In addition to this, the Town Hall also functions as an event venue and is frequently used for arts and cultural events such as plays, concerts, exhibitions, and all manner of festivals. Just south of the tram stop, at the intersection with Flinders Lane, there's another crossover, providing a place for trams to reverse direction during a disruption. Just past the crossover, the line passes St Paul's Cathedral before reaching the southern end of the CBD, where we emerge back into the sunlight and cross routes 70, 75 and the City Circle at Flinders Street. This is the southern end of the car-free section of Swanston Street and is probably the most recognisable intersection in Melbourne. There are iconic landmarks on all 4 corners here, the most notable of which is Flinders Street Station, which is the hub of the suburban railway network. Just south of the intersection is the busiest tram stop on the entire system, located between Flinders Street Station and Federation Square. A lot of passengers interchange with suburban trains here and vice versa, so this stop is always busy, and in order to deal with the passenger volumes here, there are Yarra Tram staff on the southbound platform during the peaks, guiding confused passengers to their correct tram. This is not as necessary for the northbound platform, as all trams heading in that direction go to Melbourne Uni, but for the southbound direction it's much more complicated, as each of the 8 routes has a different destination. So it's handy to have staff on hand at a place like this to help confused passengers find the correct tram, particularly those who don't have a good understanding of the tram network. At the southern end of the tram stop there's a busy pedestrian crossing. No, not that one. This one. At face value, there doesn't appear to be anything interesting about it, but up until 1999, this was actually a proper intersection. In fact, this wasn't just an intersection, this was also a tramway junction. This was once the intersection of Swanston Street and Batman Avenue, and just around the corner is the site of the Princess Bridge tram terminus, which was the original terminus of tram Route 70. If you watched my Route 75 video, you'll know that in 1999, Batman Avenue was realigned to connect into Exhibition Street as part of the CityLink project. As a consequence, the tram alignment, including the terminus, was immediately abandoned, and instead the line all the way back to Richmond Station was replaced by a new alignment running behind the tennis centre and over the new Exhibition Street Bridge into Flinders Street, which is the alignment Route 70 still takes today. From 1930 until 1999, there was a single track curve from Swanston Street into the Route 70 terminus, which could have theoretically allowed some of the Swanston Street routes to divert via Batman Avenue and Swan Street if need be. However, in practice, this probably didn't happen, as there are much better routes further south that trams can use if there's a disruption. At this point, Swanston Street becomes St Kilda Road and crosses the Yarra on the very historic Princess Bridge. This bridge has a very interesting and storied history. The first river crossing built on this site was a tolled wooden trestle bridge which opened in 1843, well before the tramline appeared. This structure was called the Balburney's Bridge, named after the man who the tolls were leased to, and only cost £400 to build, which is equivalent to about $133,000 in today's money, so it was pretty cheap. Naturally, it was by all accounts a pretty poorly designed structure, with a journalist from the Argus in 1930 describing it as a primitive construction of piles and planking, 120 foot in length and with a roadway 17 foot wide, flanked on one side by a railed off footpath. Unsurprisingly, this structure was only in use for 5 years before being replaced by a much more solid stone arch bridge in 1850. This was the first bridge to carry the Princess Bridge name and was named after Prince Albert, the then Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII. At the time of its construction, it was one of the longest and flattest stone arch bridges anywhere in the world and served Melbourne for about 30 years. However, less than a year after the bridge's opening, gold was discovered in regional Victoria, signalling the start of the gold rush. This saw Melbourne's population skyrocket, resulting in increased traffic crossing the Princess Bridge, and because of this, the decision was made in the late 1870s to replace the 30-year-old bridge. The old bridge was disassembled and replaced by a temporary structure on a different alignment in 1884, with the current structure opening 4 years later in 1888. The current Princess Bridge is an arch bridge very similar in appearance to the Blackfriars Bridge in London. It features bluestone piers and granite abutments, and was actually built using materials recycled from the old bridge. It is still one of the most important crossings of the Yarra today, carrying a substantial number of pedestrians, trams and private vehicles, and forms the main entrance into the CBD from the south. To this day, the Princess Bridge is one of Melbourne's most famous structures, and the view of the bridge from South Bank towards Fed Square and St Paul's Cathedral is arguably one of the most iconic shots in Melbourne. If you've ever purchased a Melbourne postal stamp or watched the local news, you'll know what I mean. It's a focal point for a lot of events, such as the Moomba Festival, and is also one of several official viewing areas for the New Year's Eve fireworks. On the other side of the bridge, we leave the Melbourne CBD and enter the suburb of South Bank. At this point, the road widens significantly, becoming a tree-lined boulevard, after which the line then briefly splits into 3 tracks, with the centre track being a loop siding. This siding is called the Arts Centre Loop, and is primarily used to stash faulty or broken down trams while they wait to be towed back to their home depot, and can also be used as a turn back during special events or disruptions. Just past the Arts Centre Loop, we arrive at, you guessed it, the Arts Precinct, which is located right next to the National Gallery of Victoria and the Arts Centre, another very recognisable structure, with the spire being an iconic Melbourne landmark. The Arts Centre is home to a complex of theatres and concert halls, and hosts a number of performances throughout the year, including stage productions, dance performances, the opera, and concert performances from bodies such as the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. About 100 metres south of the tram stop is the intersection with South Bank Boulevard and Linlithgow Avenue. This is where the first of the 8 Swanston Street routes leaves the corridor, namely Route 1, which turns west into South Bank Boulevard and then southwest into Sturt Street to head towards its terminus at South Melbourne Beach. It used to be a bit of a problem here that Route 1 trams waiting to turn into South Bank Boulevard would block trams on the other 7 routes, but that was resolved in 2008 when some changes were made to the track layout here, coinciding with the construction of the Arts Centre Loop. A third dedicated track was built for trams turning right here so they can wait for their turn in the light cycle without blocking the main line, similar to the new layout back at Victoria Street. That project also coincided with the construction of the current Arts Precinct tram stop, which replaced 2 former ground level stops at City Road and South Bank Boulevard. Continuing south from South Bank Boulevard, the line passes the Police Memorial and the South Bank campus of the University of Melbourne. To the east of the line here is the Domain Parklands, made up of the Alexandra Gardens, Queen Victoria Gardens, King's Domain, and the Royal Botanic Gardens, forming a combined 126-hectare area of parkland and open space. The parklands are home to some major structures, including, but not limited to, the official residence of the Governor of Victoria, Government House, La Trobe's Cottage, the Sydney Myer Music Bowl, and also a number of statues of people such as King George V, Australia's first Governor-General Lord Hopetoun, Sir John Monash, Sir Thomas Blamey, Edith Cavell, and Sir Edward Weary Dunlop, just to name a few. You'll notice that war and the armed forces are a bit of a theme with these, as most of the people honoured here have some association with the armed forces. This area is also home to a number of memorial structures, such as the aforementioned Police Memorial, which commemorates all officers in Victoria who have died in the line of duty, as well as a number of war memorials, continuing the armed forces theme, the largest and most recognisable of which is the iconic Shrine of Remembrance. The shrine is a very imposing structure and is one of the largest war memorials in the country. It's located on top of a hill and geographically lines up with Swanston Street and St Kilda Road, forming an imposing backdrop for pedestrians, vehicles and trams heading to and from the city on St Kilda Road. The idea for a major war memorial here was first proposed right after the end of the First World War in November 1918 and actually went through a rather long period of development, in part due to major opposition led by one Keith Murdoch and the Herald. Construction eventually began in 1927 after Sir John Monash managed to garner enough support for the shrine to win over the state government, and the shrine was completed and dedicated in 1934. It was originally built to honour the soldiers who fought in World War I. However, after World War II, the shrine was expanded to accommodate memorials to those who fought in that war. And today it functions as a memorial to those who have fought for Australia in all conflicts, not just the two world wars. It also serves as Melbourne's main venue for annual observances of Remembrance Day and Anzac Day, with the section of St Kilda Road leading up to the shrine also serving as the main route for the annual Anzac Day March. Anyway, back to routes 5 and 64. After the shrine, the Armed Forces theme continues as the line passes Park Street and Domain Road, where we arrive at the next major stop, Anzac Station, the last connection with the metro tunnel on this route. The stop at Anzac Station has a large island platform capable of fitting 4 short trams in each direction, and also has this large overhead canopy. The main entrance to the railway station drops down in the middle of the tram platform, creating a platform-to-platform interchange between trains and trams, something we don't really have anywhere else in the city. Route 58 briefly joins the line here, coming out of Park Street, and runs down St Kilda Road for about 600 metres, briefly increasing the total number of routes here back to 8 again. The line down Park Street eventually leads to William Street in the city, making Anzac Station the interchange point between trams running through the city on Swanston Street and trams running through the city on William Street. And because of this, the stop here was one of the busiest interchanges on the entire system before the railway station was built. In addition to the junction with Park Street, there's also a second junction here for the line heading into Domain Road, which at the time of writing is currently unused. But that wasn't always the case, and to explain this, we have to delve into some of this stop's history. When this stop first opened with the line in 1888, it was called Domain Interchange and was located a bit further north, between the Domain Road and Park Street intersections. It originally served as the junction for the cable tram line to Toorak, which ran along Domain Road, Park Street, no, not that one, and Toorak Road. It later served as the terminus for trams coming in from actual Park Street and William Street when that line opened in 1925, and the stop was rebuilt in 1985 with a third platform to allow these trams to terminate and reverse direction without blocking the St Kilda Road main line. The stop was rebuilt again in 2013 with a fourth platform added to allow trams to turn left into Domain Road without blocking the St Kilda Road main line, becoming the first and currently only stop in Melbourne to have ever had this layout. However, the new arrangement only lasted 5 years, as the stop was closed and demolished in 2018 to make way for the construction of the Melbourne Metro Tunnel and Anzac Station. Before the closure, Route 58 was actually 2 separate routes, Route 8 and Route 55. Route 8 ran from Toorak to Moreland via Swanston Street, while Route 55 ran from Domain Interchange to West Coburg via William Street. In May 2017, as part of a timetable rewrite to facilitate the closure of Domain Interchange, Route 8 permanently ceased operation, and Route 55 was extended east to Route 8's old terminus at Toorak, being renumbered to Route 58 in the process. Meanwhile, Route 6 was extended north from Melbourne Uni to Route 8's old terminus at Moreland. 2 months after this rewrite, Domain Road was closed for 5 years to allow for construction of the station, with Route 58 trams being diverted along a newer and much straighter alignment along Toorak Road West. At the time of writing, this alignment is still in place, despite the main road having reopened in November 2024. There is still some ongoing debate at the time of writing about whether or not to reinstate the original alignment, given the new alignment is much straighter, removing two 90-degree turns. It's my personal opinion that the old alignment should be reinstated, given the track has already been laid, the overhead has been reinstated, and new tram platforms have been built on Domain Road at Anzac Station, which are currently being used as bus stops. The track on the section of Domain Road which wasn't closed, as well as on the other Park Street, was left as it was, and as far as I'm aware, it's still in operational condition despite not having been used for 9 years. Basically all that's left to do is to reinstate the connection at the Toorak Road end, which wouldn't be particularly hard to do. The old alignment along Domain Road also comes closer to the Royal Botanic Gardens than any other lines in the area, and there are also businesses on Domain Road which have established themselves in that location because of the tram line. Also, I just can't really picture that section of Domain Road without a tram line. However, should the government decide to keep the new alignment along Toorak Road, I would completely understand why, given it's a much more direct and faster alignment. Plus it also means Route 58 can access the main platforms at Anzac Station, something which wouldn't be possible if it returns to Domain Road. After Domain Interchange was closed and demolished, St Kilda Road was realigned around the work site, and a new temporary stop was built just north of the intersection with Park Street. This new track layout once again included a third track for trams turning left into Park Street. However, because the new stop was on the other side of the intersection, trams on Route 58 didn't have access to it, so the actual interchange, operationally speaking, was moved a bit further down the line to Toorak Road. This temporary arrangement existed throughout most of the construction period. However, in late 2022, St Kilda Road was moved onto its permanent alignment over the station. At the same time, the new tram interchange was opened, becoming the first new piece of infrastructure delivered by the project to open to the public. The stop and railway station were named as a result of a public competition, with the name Anzac being chosen due to the station's proximity to the Shrine of Remembrance, which is clearly visible from the tram platform. The new track layout at Anzac retained the old 4-track layout for left-turning trams, albeit there's only 2 platforms at the actual tram stop. However, oddly enough, the connection between St Kilda Road and Domain Road wasn't reinstated, as the new layout connects Domain Road with Park Street only. It is still possible to access Park Street from St Kilda Road, and this connection is still being used by Route 58 while the original alignment is being reinstated. In the event of a disruption, St Kilda Road trams can be diverted here, turning into Park Street, and there are several possible routes to choose from. Trams can just skip a short section of St Kilda Road between here and the Arts Centre using Sturt Street. However, if the line through the city on Swanston Street is disrupted, trams are able to run through the city on William Street, from where they can either return to the normal route via Latrobe Street or terminate at Flagstaff Station using the Dudley Street sidings. In theory, all 8 routes can physically be diverted, but in practice these streets just aren't set up to handle that amount of tram traffic, so in reality only a handful of routes, usually about 2 or 3, will be diverted, while the rest will terminate at some of the intermediate crossovers on Swanston Street. Continuing south another 380 metres, we arrive at Toorak Road, where Route 58 turns east. The stop here has 3 platforms, an arrangement which came into effect when Route 58 was diverted here from Domain Road, and this allows left-turning trams to wait for their turn in the light cycle without impacting the main line, similar to the arrangement at many of the junctions we have passed so far. In fact, this is the last junction with this layout that we'll be encountering. From here, routes 5 and 64 continue south along St Kilda Road through a narrow strip of medium-density apartment towers bounded by Fawkner Park to the east and Queen's Road to the west. At the other end of Fawkner Park, we arrive at the next major stop, Commercial Road, where Route 72 turns east to head towards the Alfred Hospital. Unlike at the previous few junctions, there is no dedicated platform or track for left-turning trams here, so trams waiting to make the turn end up blocking the main line. However, this isn't as big of a problem given there aren't as many routes using the corridor at this point. After Commercial Road, the line continues south in a straight line for another 600 metres to the next major intersection, High Street, where Route 6 turns east to head towards its terminus at Glen Iris, and from here the main line crosses Union Street before entering a shallow cutting and arriving at St Kilda Junction. This is the unofficial southern end of the Swanston Street St Kilda Road corridor, and there are 8 roads that intersect here, namely St Kilda Road, Punt Road, Albert Street, Seekers Way, formerly Nelson Street, Wellington Street, Barclay Street, Fitzroy Street, Queen's Road, and also Queen's Way, which passes underneath. This intersection has a very interesting and storied history, having been reconfigured several times. It was originally a large intersection of 8 streets, 4 of which carried trams. Within the centre of the intersection was a half-union tram junction with the lines heading southwest down Fitzroy Street and east down Wellington Street. The line along Wellington Street originally opened in 1891 as the eastern half of the Windsor to St Kilda cable tramway, which ran from Chapel Street in Windsor to the end of Ackland Street in the heart of St Kilda via Wellington Street and Fitzroy Street. This was the final cable tram line to open in Melbourne, and in 1925 became the first cable line to be electrified. Actually, it was one of the first lines to be electrified. The line back to Domain Interchange happened to be electrified on the same day. When the tramway junction here was first constructed, it was originally just a simple H crossing, with trams only able to continue straight through here. The first change to the layout here came in 1897, when a double-track connection from St Kilda Road into Fitzroy Street was added to allow St Kilda Road trams to head towards the beach. When the lines through here were electrified in 1925, a second curve from St Kilda Road into Wellington Street was added, allowing St Kilda Road trams to head towards Windsor and beyond. With the new track layout, trams on Route 5 were extended to run into the city via St Kilda Road. Meanwhile, trams on the modern-day Route 64 ran through to St Kilda Beach using the straight-through connection here. This would be the layout of the junction for the next 4 decades. However, during that time, a number of things changed. Due to its very nature, St Kilda Junction has always been a massive traffic conundrum. In an attempt to make tram operations a bit smoother, a small signal box was built over a shop awning on what is now the southeastern corner of Wellington Street and St Kilda Road. Its position gave it a good view of the junction, and from the signal box, a signaller would coordinate trams, setting the route for each one based on its destination. Traffic problems continued to get worse, and this was only exacerbated after World War II when cars started to become more affordable for the average person. In an attempt to combat this surge in traffic, a roundabout was installed here in 1955 to at least make the flow of traffic through here a bit smoother. Nonetheless, the traffic jam persisted, and if you want an idea of what it would have been like here, just imagine the Haymarket roundabout in Parkville, but on steroids. Going into the 1960s, it became clear that a more permanent solution for the St Kilda Junction conundrum was needed. So in 1967, the coalition state government of the day, under the leadership of Premier Sir Henry Bolte, yeah, that Bolte, began work on a major rebuild and redesign of the intersection in an attempt to improve traffic flow. The main part of this rebuild involved the construction of a new road connecting Dandenong Road through to Queen's Road. This new road was named Queen's Way and passes under Punt and St Kilda roads, bypassing both the intersection itself and also the entirety of Wellington Street. Meanwhile, the main junction was split into 3 separate intersections in an attempt to make it a bit easier to understand. Initially, the tram lines through here were going to be kept on their existing alignments. However, the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board, under the leadership of their chairman, Major General Robert Risen, pressured the state government into including the relocation of the tram lines in the project. The biggest of these changes involved the construction of a new alignment in the median of Queen's Way to replace the alignment along Wellington Street. Trams were moved onto this new alignment upon the completion of the project in late 1968, ending the Wellington Street line's 77 years of operation. The new arrangement saw the existing half-union tramway junction replaced by 2 double-flat junctions, one for the line into Queen's Way and the other for the line into Fitzroy Street. The signal box was also abolished as part of the rebuild, with drivers now operating the points here instead of a signaller. The layout of the junctions means it is no longer possible to head from Fitzroy Street towards Dandenong Road, essentially severing the original St Kilda to Windsor line in 2. Wellington Street itself still exists today, and is now a quiet side street. Quite a contrast to the congested, narrow, inner-city thoroughfare it was pre-1968. The layout of the road was altered after Queen's Way opened, and the abandoned track was either ripped up or buried under the road surface at some point. I'm fairly confident in saying that trams cannot run this way anymore. However, the old cable engine house is still in place opposite the intersection of Wellington Street and Marlton Crescent, and is the only surviving evidence of both the line and also of the cable tram era. It even has the words engine house written in big black letters right on the front. How convenient. Since the overhaul, the layout of St Kilda Junction has remained virtually unchanged, aside from a few minor upgrades. So the project obviously succeeded in fixing most of the traffic problems plaguing the junction. St Kilda Junction is notable for being a pretty hostile place for pedestrians, and crossing the roads here as a pedestrian is pretty challenging. Pedestrian access to the main tram stop here is also pretty restrictive. There are only two legal ways to access the platforms here. One is via a walkway from Punt Road, while the other involves walking through a maze of pedestrian underpasses which can be accessed from either St Kilda Road or Punt Road. These underpasses are pretty grim and ugly, very much a product of the era in which they were built, but are brightened up significantly by a mixture of both official and unofficial graffiti, which not only adds some colour here, but also ensures that all the signs are virtually illegible. The platforms themselves are at ground level, inhibiting wheelchair access, and the whole area is just a maze of concrete as far as the eye can see. All in all, it's not a particularly pretty place, although the area is made significantly more interesting by some pretty quirky buildings, including this very interesting looking apartment tower located on the corner where the signal box used to be. I think it's supposed to resemble a bunch of stacked shipping containers or something. Just west of St Kilda Junction is the Junction Oval, which was the historic home of the St Kilda Football Club for 67 years until 1964. Some of the area near Junction Oval was lost as part of the rebuild to allow for a realignment of Queen's Road to connect it into Queen's Way. But most of the Oval was spared, and today it serves as the headquarters of Cricket Victoria. The Oval is also used to host cricket matches for various domestic leagues, such as the WBBL, Sheffield Shield, and One Day Cup. At St Kilda Junction, trams can head in one of three directions. Route 16 turns southwest into Fitzroy Street, and routes 3 and 67 continue straight down St Kilda Road, while routes 5 and 64 turn east onto a ramp and dive under the Punt Road Bridge before returning to ground level in the median of Queen's Way. Queen's Way is really emblematic of the time it was built, and like the junction itself, is basically covered in concrete. The road has 3 lanes in each direction, along with a 4th eastbound lane coming in from Albert Street, and has the tram line running in the median strip. It gives a real glimpse into what 1960s road-centric urban design looked like, and it's almost built like a freeway. The next stop on the line is called Queen's Way on Queen's Way. Wait a minute, let me just check my notes real quick. Hang on. Queen's Way on Upton Road? Huh? Oh, come on. Really, Yarra Trams? You got the roads the wrong way around? How on earth did you do that? Yeah, they got the road names the wrong way around. It's actually supposed to be called Upton Road on Queen's Way. Great job, Yarra Trams. This stop is famous amongst enthusiasts as being one of the most hostile on the entire system, and it's not hard to tell why. Now, before we go any further, I would just like to clarify something. I am in no way against road centre tram alignments or having tram stops in road medians. Any tram stop located in a road median, or just on a road for that matter, is going to be noisy as cars, get this, make noise. I'm a regular user of these kinds of stops, and yeah, it can get pretty noisy as cars fly past at 60 to 70 k's an hour while I'm waiting for my tram, but it's not absolutely unbearable. The stop at Upton Road on Queen's Way, however, is a different story. The stop and road are located in a large concrete cutting, and there are properties which back onto frontage roads running parallel to Queen's Way on either side. Because of this, there are sound barriers running the length of the road. Now, while the sound barriers and retaining walls do a pretty good job at keeping the adjacent residential areas pretty quiet, which is of course what they were designed to do, those sound waves have to go somewhere, and that somewhere is of course back onto the road, making the road much noisier than it otherwise would be. Now, if you're a motorist flying along at 70 k's an hour, this probably won't affect you. But if you're a passenger waiting at the tram stop, the constant, almost deafening noise can make it really unpleasant to wait for a tram here. Geez, when's the next tram coming? The stop itself isn't particularly glamorous either, and like the stop back at St Kilda Junction, features very basic ground level platforms. The platforms are separated from the road by means of these very basic metal crash barriers, and there's practically no separation between these and the tram platform. The platforms are demarcated by the standard tram stop flag signs, and there's also this pretty basic green shelter on the outbound platform. The limits of the platforms are defined by these signs telling pedestrians not to pass, but they aren't positioned correctly relative to the flag signs, which are what drivers use to judge where they need to stop their tram at stops which don't have proper platforms. For example, on the inbound side, this sign prevents anyone from accessing any part of the tram beyond where the first door is, while this one says that it's perfectly fine to just go 50 metres in that direction, in the middle of what is practically a freeway. You know, because there's nothing weird about that at all. Similar to the situation over at Deakin Uni on Route 75, the only means of access to the stop at Upton Road is by means of a set of stairs coming down from the Upton Road overpass. However, these stairs only lead down to the outbound platform, meaning that any passengers wishing to access the inbound platform have to cross the line. The stairs are obviously a big barrier to wheelchair accessibility here, and combining that with the ground level platforms and the fact that over half the trams that come through here are high floor trams anyway, there are a total of 3 barriers to wheelchair access here. If you want to learn more about the accessibility issues here and at other stops around the tram network, Marcus Wong has a blog post about it, which I'll link in the description. Oh, finally, my ears are saved. After Upton Road, the line does a slight wiggle to the south to align with Wellington Street, although the line isn't actually back on its original alignment just yet. We then arrive at Chapel Street, where routes 5 and 64 cross tram route 78. Unlike the stop at Upton Road, the stop at Chapel Street actually has proper platforms, and passengers are able to change here for the Sandringham line at Windsor Station, which is a 100-metre walk away down Chapel Street. This was the eastern terminus of the original cable tram line via Wellington Street when it opened in 1891. It remained the terminus until the cable line was electrified in 1925, which saw it connected to an already existing electric tramway heading east from here, which I'll start to talk about in a little bit. Trams can still terminate here in the event of a disruption, using a crossover just east of the intersection to reverse direction. From Chapel Street, the line continues into Dandenong Road and passes over the Sandringham line. The bridge over the Sandringham line was widened to the south when Queensway was built in order to create a smooth transition between it and Dandenong Road. The original single carriageway bridge here is now used by outbound traffic, which is why only the outbound carriageway geographically lines up with Wellington Street and not the inbound side. Heading underneath the bridge on a train, you can also see that the outbound side of the bridge is supported on brick arches, but then changes to concrete pillars for the inbound side, showing where the bridge was widened. Continuing east across the railway, the line changes character almost completely as it resumes its original pre-1968 alignment. This next section of the line, from Chapel Street to Hawthorne Road, was built by the Paran and Malvern Tramways Trust, the PMTT, in 1911. It ran from the cable tram terminus at Windsor Station down Dandenong Road and Glenferrie Road to Wattletree Road in Malvern, where it connected to an existing electric tramway which had opened a year earlier. Like on Queensway, the line along Dandenong Road runs in the median strip, but while Queensway is regarded as one of the ugliest sections of tramway on the network, the line along Dandenong Road is considered to be one of the most attractive road centre tram alignments in Melbourne. The tramway here is lined with London plane trees and Canary date palms and features significant sections of ballasted track, along with these very attractive ornate overhead wiring poles which date from the line's opening. These poles are of a design used heavily by the PMTT on most of their network, and are designed to be positioned in between the two tracks. However, most of the former PMTT network ran, and in fact still runs, in mixed traffic conditions, so unsurprisingly, there was a constant issue of ignorant motorists colliding with the overhead wiring structures. As a result, the original poles on most of the PMTT network were replaced with a much less obstructive type, reducing the risk of collisions. But because the section of line along Dandenong Road doesn't run in mixed traffic, the original poles here were retained and remain in use to this day. They're listed on the Victorian Heritage Register as they're some of the oldest overhead wiring poles on the tram network, and are also some of the last surviving poles of their kind. Now, seeing as we've left pre-electrification territory, it's time to talk about route number changes. Now, while the PMTT did have a route numbering system, I'm not going to really delve into it here since it isn't particularly easy to decipher relative to the modern network. When the current route numbering system for the tram network was introduced in 1934, the lines we now know as routes 5 and 64 were numbered as, well, routes 5 and 64. The only significant change to Route 5 since then was in March of 2006, when it was briefly replaced by an extended Route 55 during the 2006 Commonwealth Games. But after the games concluded, Route 5 was reinstated and Route 55 was truncated back to domain interchange. As for Route 64, there's a bit more to talk about. In 1938, Route 64 trams from East Brighton were diverted to run into the city via Balaclava Road, while the service along Dandenong Road was replaced by a shuttle running from Balaclava Junction to St Kilda Beach, numbered as Route 67. Not to be confused with the modern day Route 67, which runs along Glen Huntly Road. However, in 1955, Route 64 trams were rerouted back onto Dandenong Road, leading to the current service arrangement we see today, and this is also when normal services stopped using the connection from Wellington Street into Fitzroy Street at St Kilda Junction. Anyway, back to Dandenong Road. Continuing east, routes 5 and 64 run in a dead straight line down Dandenong Road along the boundary of Windsor and St Kilda East, crossing Hotham Street and Williams Road and passing the St Kilda Cemetery. Continuing another 600 metres, we arrive at Orrong Road. There's a crossover here which provides another place for trams to reverse direction in case of a disruption, and in addition to that, it is also used for a very special purpose, which we'll discuss in a minute. Continuing another 300 metres, we arrive at Wattletree Road, where routes 5 and 64 finally split apart, with Route 5 turning onto Wattletree Road to head towards its terminus at Malvern, while Route 64 continues southeast along Dandenong Road. From 7 PM until 6 AM each night, Route 64 operates as a shuttle from here to East Brighton, with passengers connecting with Route 5 trams to or from the city. This is the only place on the tram network where part-time shuttle running regularly happens as part of the normal timetable, and when this setup was first introduced, the roles were actually reversed. Route 5 operated the shuttle to Malvern, while Route 64 provided the through service to the city, an arrangement commonly referred to as the yo-yo. If you look at a satellite view of the two lines, it's obvious why that arrangement made sense. Route 5 is clearly the shorter branch, so having the shorter branch run as a shuttle and the longer branch run for through service to the city mirrors how certain parts of the railway network operate. However, in October 2023, a major timetable rewrite flipped the arrangement. Route 64 was reassigned as the shuttle instead, and the reason why comes down to accessibility. Remember at the start of the video when I mentioned that Route 64 uses only high floor trams, while Route 5 runs a mix of both high and low floor trams? Well, having Route 5 run as the shuttle came with the interesting side effect where at certain times of the day, there'd be no low floor service to sections of the line between St Kilda Junction and Wattletree Road. For passengers who rely on low-floor trams to board, that was a major barrier, so the shuttle was switched to ensure an accessible service was always provided on Dandenong Road. Something else you'll also notice here is that there's no crossover at Wattletree Road, so that begs the question, how on earth does the shuttle reverse direction? Well, that's where the crossover at Orrong Road comes in. During shuttle running, what normally happens is an inbound Route 5 tram will come in from Wattletree Road, followed by an inbound Route 64 shuttle coming immediately behind from Dandenong Road. After making the stop at Wattletree Road, both trams will continue forward to Orrong Road, where the shuttle will terminate, sharing the platform with the Route 5 tram in front. The platform at Orrong Road is not long enough to fit both trams completely on the platform, so passengers on the shuttle can only exit from the first door. The Route 5 tram will then depart towards the city, after which an outbound tram will then come through and drop off Route 64 passengers at Wattletree Road, where they will then be collected by the shuttle as it heads back out towards East Brighton. This is also identical to how the shuttle operated before October 2023. Just with the roles reversed. I think this is a good example of how the tramways are able to make the most of the infrastructure that's available. While the track layout here is a bit restrictive as there isn't anywhere for the shuttle to reverse direction without blocking the main line, it's used in a very clever way to allow the shuttle to terminate and reverse direction without blocking the connecting service, but still allowing passengers to easily make the connection without having to wait. The only issue is that the platform at Orrong Road isn't long enough to fit both trams. They should probably look into that. Now, while this is essentially a video on Route 64, it's actually not far to the Route 5 terminus from here, and if I did it as a separate video, it would be awkwardly short, so why not do it now? Leaving Dandenong Road, Route 5 does a slight wiggle to the north to align with Wattletree Road, after which the line enters mixed traffic, which remains the case for the rest of the way out to the terminus at Malvern. Continuing east, Route 5 crosses Kooyong Road before jumping over the Pakenham, Cranbourne and Frankston lines on an overpass, after which the line then passes the Malvern Central Shopping Centre, not to be confused with the Melbourne Central Shopping Centre. Malvern, Melbourne, sounds kinda similar. After passing the shopping centre, the line crosses Glenferrie Road and tram route 16. Passengers are able to change here for the Pakenham, Cranbourne and Frankston lines at Malvern Station, which is a 400-metre walk away down Glenferrie Road and Station Street. In fact, this is the last train connection and the last tram connection on Route 5. The next section of Route 5 from here to the terminus at Malvern opened in 1910, and just like the section back on Dandenong Road, was built by the PMTT. In fact, funnily enough, the line we're crossing right now on Glenferrie Road is actually a continuation of that very same PMTT built line we left back at Dandenong Road. Don't worry, it'll all make sense a bit later. When the line first opened in 1910, the only connection to the rest of the network was via the line continuing north along Glenferrie Road from here. When the line along Dandenong Road opened, trams from Wattletree Road were diverted to turn south into Glenferrie Road here before swinging back into Dandenong Road. But in 1928, the current alignment opened, linking Wattletree Road directly into Dandenong Road and giving Route 5 a much straighter path into the city. Once that direct connection was in place, the old east to south curve from Wattletree Road into Glenferrie Road became redundant and was removed sometime afterwards. There is still a curve on the northeastern corner of the intersection, which is a relic from the original line opening. Today, it's primarily used to provide access to Malvern Depot, which is about 300 metres north of here on Glenferrie Road. The curve can also be used to divert Route 5 trams away from Dandenong Road in the event of a disruption, and like at Anzac Station, there are several alternative routes to choose from, with trams able to use High Street, Commercial Road or even Toorak Road. There's also a crossover at Glenferrie Road, located just to the east of the intersection, which can also be used to reverse trams if the line east of here is disrupted. You might also notice there's no west to north curve from Wattletree Road into Glenferrie Road here, which would theoretically provide access to Malvern Depot from the city, but that connection isn't actually needed here, and I'll explain why a little later on. From Glenferrie Road, the line leaves the shopping area behind and enters a leafy residential setting with tall deciduous trees lining the road. We then pass the Cabrini Hospital, which is one of the main private hospitals serving Melbourne's southeastern suburbs. The hospital was first opened in 1958 by Archbishop Daniel Mannix and was at the time the largest private hospital in the state. While the hospital has been expanded several times, the original cream brick buildings from 1958 are still in use today and managed to blend in quite well with the surrounding area. Continuing from the hospital, the line crosses Taronga Road and enters the suburb of Malvern East, continuing through the same leafy suburban scene for the last kilometre to the terminus at Burke Road. The terminus itself is nothing special, merely just a simple single ground level platform, and there aren't really any other public transport connections here aside from the Route 624 bus to Kew and Oakley, which runs on an hourly frequency. If you like walking, it is possible to change here for Glen Waverley line trains at Darling Station. However, I wouldn't recommend changing for the train here, as the station is about 1.5 kilometres away. And yes, this is something I actually did in the process of filming. You're welcome. Next to the terminus is Central Park, not to be confused with the much more well-known Central Park in New York, which is about 16,500 kilometres away. Central Park in Malvern East is an 8.6 hectare parcel of parkland and is a lovely spot to just relax or go for a short jog. It's also home to the Central Park Conservatory, which was built in 1927 and is one of only 3 public conservatories in the entire state. There's also this nice historic fountain here too, which was built at the same time as the conservatory. There's a small strip of shops on Wattletree Road and Burke Road here, which is home to a cafe, a dentist, an optometrist, a newsagent, and a milk bar, which has surprisingly managed to stay afloat at a time when many suburban milk bars are slowly vanishing. All in all, it's a nice and peaceful inner suburban scene. There are proposals from the Public Transport Users Association and the Rail Futures Institute to extend Route 5 another 1.5 kilometres further east along Wattletree Road and Malvern Road to Darling Station, which would be a pretty easy and inexpensive thing to do, and would make a lot of sense given there just aren't a lot of connections at the current terminus. However, this is just a proposal, and there hasn't really been any movement on it in quite some time. Anyway, that's Route 5 done. Now let's just backtrack a bit to Dandenong Road and continue with the main story. Tekkie from editing, if you will. Right, so we're back at the junction with Route 64, and this time we're curving slightly to the southeast to continue along Dandenong Road. Shortly after Wattletree Road, the line crosses Kooyong Road. And yes, this is the same Kooyong Road which Route 5 crosses about 150 metres north of here. If you have the right gear, get the timing right, and are lucky enough not to get photobombed by a truck, it is possible to get a photo of a tram on both lines crossing Kooyong Road simultaneously, which I was sadly unable to get. From Kooyong Road, Route 64 continues southeast along its tree-lined alignment. An interesting thing to note on this section of line are a couple of stops which look largely conventional, but don't actually have any means of access. Well, that is, any safe or legal means of access. There aren't any formal pedestrian crossings at these stops, so the only way to get to them is by jaywalking, across 4 busy lanes of 70km/h traffic. When I visited, I of course did not attempt to do this as I actually value my life. In fact, I don't think anyone would really be willing to do the real life version of Crossy Road to get to the tram stops here unless they're a real thrill seeker. The facilities at these stops are pretty bare bones too. They don't have proper platforms, just these concrete slabs which only cover the area as far as the first door on a tram. There are also these shelters for some reason, which are probably barely used at all. They look to be quite historic, so I assume these date from the original line opening. Continuing southeast, we eventually arrive at a 5-way intersection with Alma Road, Railway Avenue and Hawthorne Road. Unlike the previous 2 stops, the stop at Hawthorne Road actually has proper platforms, and there's also this very historic old waiting shelter here which dates back to the opening of the line in 1911. This is the location of a Y junction with the line heading south along Hawthorne Road. Route 64 turns south onto Hawthorne Road here, and passengers can also change here for Route 16, which comes in from the east on Dandenong Road and also turns into Hawthorne Road. In addition to the connection with Route 16, passengers are also able to change here for Pakenham, Cranbourne and Frankston line trains at Malvern Station, which is a short walk away down Dandenong Road. 100 metres east of here, Route 16 makes a sharp 75-degree turn north into Glenferrie Road, and the straight-through connection at Hawthorne Road sees regular use by Route 5 trams heading from the city to Malvern Depot and vice versa, given the lack of access into Glenferrie Road from Wattletree Road coming from that direction. This connection is also occasionally used by Route 16 to divert via Dandenong Road during a disruption, rejoining the normal route at St Kilda Junction. Trams can also terminate at Hawthorne Road using a crossover to the east of the intersection on Dandenong Road, although for Route 64 this isn't a common occurrence. Just around the corner in Hawthorne Road there's actually another tram stop for Dandenong Road. This stop is for northbound trams only, and it's really weird having a stop there given there are platforms on both sides of the intersection on Dandenong Road anyway. I assume this stop exists purely to allow for a better interchange between routes 16 and 64, given that transferring between the 2 lines using the stops on Dandenong Road involves crossing the road 3 times. The distance between the 2 stops is only about 55 metres, making it, I think, the shortest distance between 2 stops on the network. In fact, if you get off the tram at Hawthorne Road at the right time, you can actually get back on that same tram on Dandenong Road. And when I visited this area to film for this video, I decided to test this theory. Well, that's my daily exercise done now. At this point, Route 64 leaves the 1911 alignment behind and turns south into Hawthorne Road, entering the suburb of Caulfield North. This is the last major turn on the line, with the rest of the route running in a mostly straight line from here down to the terminus at East Brighton. This next part of the line from here down to Balaclava Road opened in 1913, and like the line back on Dandenong Road, was built by the PMTT. From Dandenong Road, the line descends down the side of a small hill and crosses Inkerman Road before passing Caulfield Park, a 27-hectare parcel of parkland which notably features a small lake and is a nice and peaceful spot to go for a picnic. At the other end of the park, the line crosses Balaclava Road and Route 3 at Balaclava Junction. This is the location of the only remaining Grand Union Tramway junction in the Southern Hemisphere. For those of you who don't have a particularly good understanding of rail junction terminology, a Grand Union is essentially the mother of all junctions. A H crossing with curves on all four corners, allowing trams to literally go from anywhere to anywhere. At Balaclava Junction, Route 64 crosses Route 3, which runs east-west along Balaclava Road, while Route 16 takes the north to west curve into Balaclava Road to head back towards the city. And this is probably a good time to point out something a bit quirky here. On the section of line from here back to Dandenong Road, the city-bound directions for Routes 16 and 64 are in opposite directions. So the inbound direction for Route 16 is the outbound direction for Route 64, and the outbound direction for Route 16 is the inbound direction for Route 64. Now, locally, this is really weird, but if you look at the broader network map, you can kind of understand why it's like this. Now, as for the other three curves here, they aren't used by any regular routes. The two curves on the southern side are primarily used by Route 3 trams accessing Glenhuntly Depot, and the south to west curve can also be used by Route 64 trams to divert via Balaclava Road if the line along Dandenong Road is disrupted. Meanwhile, the north to east curve is only ever used during disruptions, allowing Route 3 trams to divert via Dandenong Road. Balaclava Road was the terminus of the line for 7 months until November 1913, when it was extended 1 kilometre south to Glenhuntly Road. This was the last extension of the line to be built by the Prahran and Malvern Tramways Trust, as it was taken over by the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board in 1920. Continuing south, the line enters the Caulfield Park Shopping Centre, which is a short shopping strip extending 200 metres south along Hawthorn Road. At the other end of the shopping strip, the line passes through a residential area before crossing Glen Eira Road and passing the Glen Eira Town Hall, originally the Caulfield Town Hall, which was built in 1890 and is listed with the Victorian Heritage Council. It's still used for more or less its original purpose today, serving as the administrative seat of the city of Glen Eira, and in addition to that, it also houses the Caulfield Library. Continuing past the town hall, the line enters the suburb of Caulfield, continuing in a dead straight line along Hawthorn Road for another 700 metres before crossing Route 67 again at Glenhuntly Road. There's a half-union junction here with two curves on the eastern side of the intersection, and these see regular use by Route 3 and 64 trams running into Glenhuntly Depot, which is about 400 metres east of here on Glenhuntly Road. The curve on the northeastern corner can also be used to divert Route 67 trams during disruptions, and there's a crossover 100 metres back towards the city on Hawthorn Road, which can be used to reverse direction during a disruption. Glenhuntly Road became the terminus of the line in November 1913, and between then and the next extension, the Prahran and Malvern Tramways Trust was absorbed by the government-owned Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board, who took over operation of the former PMTT network in 1920, and in 1925, the line on Hawthorn Road was extended another kilometre south to North Road. South of Glenhuntly Road, we enter the suburb of Caulfield South, with the line becoming much quieter as we enter a mostly residential setting. Continuing south, the line passes Princes Park, no, a different one, before passing the Brighton General Cemetery and arriving at the next major intersection, North Road. There's one more crossover here, which is the last place on the line where trams can terminate short of the terminus. This was the end of the line from 1925 until 1937, when the line was extended another 1.5 kilometres to what was then Point Nepean Road, which is still the terminus today. From North Road, the line continues south along Hawthorn Road into the suburb of Brighton East and enters a small shopping strip, but this changes moments later as we once again continue through mostly residential scenery. The line then crosses Elster Creek and Union Street, continuing in a dead straight line for another 500 metres before finally entering another small shopping strip and arriving at the terminus at East Brighton, which is located at the southern end of Hawthorn Road at the Nepean Highway. The terminus is just a simple single platform, with the two tracks merging into one at the northern end. This is actually the first accessible platform stop we've encountered since all the way back at the other end of Hawthorne Road, as all the stops on the line between here and Dandenong Road are just simple curbside stops due to the mixed traffic nature of that part of the line. This is also the southernmost point on the entire Melbourne tram network. In fact, since Hobart ripped up the last of their tram network in 1960, this is actually the southernmost tram terminus in the world, with the exception of a tourist tram in Christchurch, New Zealand. In terms of connections to other forms of public transport, there isn't really much here. There aren't any bus routes running down the Nepean Highway here, aside from the Skybus Peninsula Express, which doesn't stop here. But just 200 metres away on Centre Road, there's the Route 703 Smart Bus, which runs from Blackburn to Middle Brighton. So, that's it. We made it. You've just listened to a roughly hour-long video about routes 5 and 64. This is the 4th video in this series where I ramble on about Melbourne tram lines for borderline ridiculous amounts of time, and if you want to check out the rest of the series, you'll find the link to the full playlist in the description. Feel free to like and subscribe, and also join the Discord server. The link for that is also in the description. Be sure to check out Balaclava Junction if you want to witness some crazy tramway action. Try not to get lost at St Kilda Junction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.
The next stop is Nepean Highway. Stop 68. This will be the last stop. Thank you for travelling with Yarra Trams.